All right. Thanks everyone for joining. It's 9 o'clock on the dot Pacific time. I'm just gonna give people another minute to roll in and then I'll get us started. Whoops. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here. As a reminder, I am recording this meeting. Hopefully you all received a notification. I will make that recording available on our website for those who couldn't join or for anyone who's here and would just like to get a recap. So my name is Elsa Ordway. I am very lucky to be the PI of PANGEA, and I'll share in a moment. We have an incredible, huge team of people who have contributed to this. So it's very much not just me, although I will be presenting our update today. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm thrilled to be able to share our draft concept for PANGEA, which is a proposed campaign, NASA Terrestrial Ecology Field Campaign in the tropics. So this is a scoping study, and we released our draft white paper on September 20th. And on the very last slide, I'll have links to share so that you can all navigate directly to that. So I'm going to spend the first 30 to 40 minutes presenting our concept, our proposed campaign, and then we'll leave plenty of time for questions and answer and discussion. So let's get started. All right. So I mentioned this before, but I just want to emphasize we have an incredible team of people who have been contributing to this. The leadership team shown here really was the core that developed the concept in 2022 when we proposed this to NASA. Since then, we've had so many people contribute to developing and advancing this concept. And what I'm proposing or presenting today is really the work of many, not just me, although you will be hearing my voice for most of today. So I truly want to acknowledge and appreciate the enormous amount of time that many people have contributed. I'm showing the faces of working group leads here, but I also want to acknowledge really over 400 people who have contributed to the developing of these concepts and the actual writing of this white paper. It's been a massive undertaking, and we could not have done it without every single one of these people. You know who you are, even if your face is not here, so thank you so much. So why are we here? What is a NASA Terrestrial Ecology Field Campaign? This is directly from the solicitation. These are campaigns that are meant to answer big science questions focused on a particular region or biome. They're meant to enable more effective interpretation of satellite measurements. This is ultimately a NASA solicitation. They're also meant to foster collaborative interactions and build new relationships within the scientific community. And within the PANGEA community also feel within the practitioner community as well. These campaigns are opportunities to train and educate the next generation of scientists, which is a key cornerstone of PANGEA. And we're also thinking from the beginning about how a campaign like this can leave a legacy data set. And frankly, I think relationships as well to support continued future research that extends well beyond the time constraints of a campaign. And NASA has a history of really successful field campaigns. I'm showing you two examples here of many. Above on the right is the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, and that's actually wrapping up currently, and then that's why NASA is seeking input on what the next campaign should be. So the Arctic Boreal Vulnerability Experiment above is really focused on this geographic domain in Canada and the Western US, largely Alaska. And I included this schematic here to illustrate what is a key element of all of these campaigns, these terrestrial ecology field campaigns, and that is their multi-scale approach to answering big science questions and advancing the way we can use satellite remote sensing. And what that means is really integrating coordinated measurements that scale from leaf and organismal levels to ecosystem scales, inclusion of flux tower data, And then pairing that with drone and aircraft data to ultimately, again, improve our ability to use satellite remote sensing data sets, and modeling is a key element of these campaigns as well. Prior to above was LBA, the large-scale biosphere-atmosphere experiment in Amazonia, and that was actually led by Brazil in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and NASA was involved in elements of that, largely LBA Eco, also LBA Trim and Hydromet. And that was an opportunity for scientists from across a variety of disciplines to come together to understand the functioning of the Amazon and its responses to change. In that case, big emphasis was on deforestation and land use change. It was also a really important opportunity for training and capacity building. LBA trained about 1,000 students, many of whom were master's and PhD students from Brazil. And so that really developed this cohort that have since of scientists who have since gone on to become leaders in academia, government, and nonprofits, just really have continued to lead the way in our ability to understand, monitor, and manage the Amazon. And so PANGEA is really building on the successes and lessons learned from these kinds of campaigns in the past. So, whoops, there's a little bit of a blue spot here. Sorry about that. I don't know where that came from, but the process for PANGEA is a 1-year effort to scope a possible campaign. And there's 2 efforts being scoped right now. So PANGEA is one focused on the tropics. ARID is another focused on dryland systems. And I highly encourage examining both of these white papers. ARID also released a white paper, which can be found on the NASA Carbon Cycle and Ecosystems website. This is really a once-in-a-decade opportunity to contribute to the potential focus areas that will guide a lot of future funding solicitations in the decade or so to come. So both teams are spending 1 year engaging the research community to identify scientific research priorities and opportunities, build relationships, and define shared goals that will really guide the success of these campaigns, and also evaluate what's truly feasible within the scope of a 6 to 9 year campaign. Both teams, as I mentioned, released our draft white papers on September 20th. These are open for public comment until November 5th, so I will share links to that at the end. And both teams will be delivering final white papers to NASA headquarters on December 6th. It won't be until early next year that NASA will make a decision about which one will move forward. And at that point, there'll be about a year or so plus of concise experimental plan development. And that's going to be the point at which NASA says, here's how much funding is actually available, and the detailed plans are developed. So what we're proposing in this white paper is the concept. And that will be the foundation from which the detailed plans are developed if NASA selects PANGEA. And at that point, about a 6 to 9 year campaign will unfold, and it's likely that the earliest starting point for the campaign will be about 2026, and I'll show a timeline later. Let me see if I can just get rid of this blue thing here. I don't know what that is. That's strange. Okay, well, I apologize, but that may just stick with us throughout. So why are we focused on tropical systems? Tropical regions are critically important at a global scale. Despite covering less than 10% of the ice-free land surface, they maintain about 2/3 of terrestrial species diversity. They're home to about 3 billion people who depend directly and indirectly on them. And they're really important for global and local and regional climate regulation as a result of their pumping of massive amounts of water and heat. They're also really important for the carbon cycle, both in terms of net primary productivity and the amount of carbon they store and sequester. Increasingly, too, it's becoming quite well known that these systems contribute an enormous amount, about 20%, to annual global methane emissions as a source of natural methane emissions. And all of these things are changing in ways that really require improved understanding for our ability to understand how they will contribute to a changing Earth system. So tropical forests, as I mentioned, are not only critically important, but also changing in ways that are that have huge global consequences. This is true in terms of the amount of rapid land use change, deforestation that's happening across the tropics. There are changes in response to climatic conditions that are changing, varying precipitation regimes. All of that is interacting with human activities. For example, fire dynamics are changing in really important and consequential ways across the tropics. And I'm showing you this diagram here on the bottom that's really kind of exploring the vulnerability or resilience of these systems to these changes. And I included these future predictions of change or resilience of specifically gross primary productivity and evapotranspiration. And really to emphasize that although we tend to treat the tropics as a single biome, there's going to be incredibly different responses within and across the tropics to these changes. And we're already seeing evidence of that. And understanding these differences is really what's at the core of PANGEA. So the ability to understand what's happening now is critical. Also, planning for future changes is critical. There's huge uncertainty in future terrestrial carbon flux dynamics. And this is a figure on the left adapted from Friedlingstein et al. Analysis of CMIP5 and CMIP6 predictions, which show that there's huge variability in the prediction of the future land flux, and particularly the tropical land flux is highly uncertain. Some of these models predict that the tropical land flux will be a source of carbon, while many others predict it will be a sink. And the difference between those two things has huge implications, again, not only for these regions, but for the entire planet. The figure on the right is showing latitude now on the x-axis, and the goal of this figure is to emphasize that although there's uncertainty in models across the planet, there's much greater uncertainty in tropical latitudes in terms of differences between, for example, CMIP6 outputs and inversions, and then the variability even just within CMIP6 models. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done to improve our ability to understand these future changes. And that really relies on improving our understanding of processes and dynamics now. And so a big part of PANGEA is also focused on thinking about how we can advance remote sensing data model integration, as well as process-based understanding of these models. And our working groups have worked really tirelessly to think about how we can build on existing efforts. This is a figure adapted from a paper in 2020 led by Rosie Fisher and Charlie Coven that really looks at the evolution of land surface models. And our modeling working group has really thought about the potential to further advance the ability of these models to represent ecosystem heterogeneity that could underpin distinct responses to change. So there's real opportunities, again, here to think about process, understanding and improving that, as well as remote sensing data model integration to capture this sort of heterogeneity in models. And as I mentioned before, we are already seeing changes in these systems that really require improved understanding. So in response to the 2015 El Nino, all of the tropical continents, which on average are carbon sinks, switched to being sources of carbon to the atmosphere. So this is from a paper that Junji Liu led in 2017, and it pulled data from the Orbiting Carbon Observatory satellite, which looks at CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and used an inversion approach to partition what were the sources of those emissions. And they found that although all of these systems became carbon sources of emissions to the atmosphere, it was for different reasons. And so in the Amazon, it was a drier land surface that led to less plant growth. In Africa, it was higher temperatures that led to increased respiration. And in Asia, it was a hotter, drier land surface that led to more fire. And these differences have major question marks linked to the mechanisms that underpin them, and also have very different implications for management pathways in response to the changes we're seeing. So again, this heterogeneity and these differences within and across the tropics is really at the heart of PANGEA. So PANGEA is focused on understanding how vulnerable or resilient tropical forest landscapes are to these kinds of changes, and what the implications are for the global carbon cycle and climatic perturbations. So PANGEA's three overarching objectives are to characterize and quantify this heterogeneity in tropical forest responses to climate and land use change, to constrain model uncertainty of future tropical carbon flux predictions by improving process understanding and advancing remote sensing data model integration, and to address calibration and validation and algorithm development needs to ensure that measurements can be accurately retrieved from satellite remote sensing data sets over the tropics, and I'll come back to that. So the ability to understand these and advance these objectives really relies on an integrated approach, and PANGEA is really focusing on these, what's in the yellow circle here, these different working group topic areas, which are focused on biogeochemical cycles, climate feedbacks and interactions, biodiversity, and social ecological systems, and how all of those interact, as well as the overarching needs to advance our ability on modeling and data synthesis. PANGEA has spent a lot of time exploring community engagement and applications priorities, and again, thinking about the feasibility. So when we're talking about the science, PANGEA is focused on carbon cycle dynamics in terms of CO2 emissions and fluxes, methane fluxes and stocks, and lateral flows of carbon as well. But we can't just stop there. To understand a system as diverse and heterogeneous as the tropics, we're really also interested in the patterns and processes related to biodiversity in these systems and how that intersects with these changing carbon cycle dynamics. In terms of variability, PANGEA is focused on multi-decadal trends and extreme events. And in terms of disturbances, PANGEA is focused on everything from deforestation and degradation to fire dynamics, drought, and storms. PANGEA is also very focused on land-atmosphere interactions, particularly thinking about carbon and water cycle dynamics. And so rainfall recycling is just one example. And there's also a big element of PANGEA focused on human dimensions and thinking about the integration of different knowledge systems, for example, integration of indigenous and local and ecological knowledge with these other types of data and information to improve our ability to understand how these systems are responding to change. And then we're also thinking a lot about the potential for PANGEA to advance applications. And so the particular areas of focus are related to mitigation, conservation, management, and adaptation. And here's some examples of the ways in which PANGEA can advance these focus areas. So thinking about the potential of these systems in terms of long-term carbon sequestration stability, the ability to improve monitoring and targeted information for biodiversity conservation and restoration, advances in sustainable agriculture to support management practices that are more sustainable. And we've heard from a lot of participants in PANGEA workshops that there's a real interest in supporting mapping capabilities that can underpin disaster alerts and responses. That's something that is very clearly a growing need across the planet, and very much so in the tropics, just as much as everywhere else. So PANGEA is really focused on, again, an integrated approach, thinking about these systems in a way that integrates these different disciplinary perspectives and approaches to thinking about biogeochemical cycles, biodiversity, climate interactions and feedbacks, social ecological systems, and disturbance dynamics. And the opportunity for a campaign like PANGEA is such that there's a capacity to integrate, again, leaf level measurements, diversity measurements that are in situ measurements like eDNA or bioacoustics or camera trap data and observations, with information about farming practices, to information and in situ measurements on things like demographic rates and how that varies across different species and communities that are quite functionally distinct. There's also a real need to integrate this with data on the ground that tells us about flux dynamics. So for example, flux towers that can yield information on CO2 and methane and water fluxes. And then this would, of course, be coordinated with drone and aircraft measurements at key landscapes, which I'll come back to in a moment. So PANGEA's overarching science questions are, what are the patterns of recent change in terms of recent kind of thinking about the last several decades? What are the patterns of recent and ongoing change in tropical forest landscapes, states, dynamics, and feedbacks, and how do they vary geographically? What processes control heterogeneity and the vulnerability of tropical forest landscapes to structural and functional change in the Anthropocene? And how will ongoing and projected future changes in tropical forest landscapes alter these feedbacks in terms of local, regional, and global climate and social ecological systems? And there's many, many questions that are more specific and tailored that are in the PANGEA white paper, and that's an area that we would really be interested in feedback on the sub-questions within the different science thematic areas that are linked to questions related to pattern, process, and projected future changes. The reason PANGEA is, we think, really critical at this moment in time is because we're in this incredibly data-rich, model-rich, and computational-rich moment. Particularly thinking about satellite remote sensing data, we have an unprecedented amount of sensors at our fingertips, both now and in the near future. And the tropics has long been a challenging place to measure and observe with remote sensing data, in part because it's very cloud covered, which is what a campaign like this can support, but also because we've been limited by, for example, certain types of measurements that allow us to get at differences in greenness, for example, from multispectral data sets. And greenness, of course, saturates in these really dense tropical systems. But we now have data sets that allow us to unpack and kind of peel back this greenness to actually parse it out into more ecologically meaningful measurements. In this case, you're seeing an example of functionally distinct ecosystems in a forest in Malaysian Borneo. And this is a representation of different plant functional traits that vary from the ridge lines to hill slopes and valleys in this system. And so with this kind of information, there's a real opportunity to push our ability to use these kinds of data sets to understand these systems in fundamentally new ways. And PANGEA is really at the heart of it focused on a suite of different remote sensing data sets, recognizing that it's really the fusion and the integration of these kinds of remote sensing data sets that's truly going to advance our ability to understand these systems. So examples of satellite sensors that PANGEA is prioritizing include things like JEDI, spaceborne LiDAR data, hyperspectral data. We now have EMIT on the International Space Station, and we'll soon have SPG and other hyperspectral sensors from international space agencies beyond even NASA. And these kinds of sensors will allow us potentially to map aspects of biodiversity, like what you can see here from airborne hyperspectral data that's mapping, again, functionally distinct communities that vary with these different plant traits. There's also data sets like SWOT, which allow us now to measure and monitor surface water flows. This is the Gabon estuary. And with these surface water flows, which is of course important for understanding the hydrological cycles of these systems, there's also really important lateral flows of nutrients and carbon that move through these systems that can really be better understood with, again, the integration of these kinds of data sets. NISAR, a forthcoming radar mission, is going to be really important for so many elements of PANGEA in terms of thinking about our ability to monitor things like ecosystem structure and biomass, as well as disturbance dynamics, but also it has a huge amount of value and utility when it comes to understanding agricultural systems, and again, potentially new ways of mapping and characterizing the diversity of these systems. And then we also have, I mentioned earlier, the Orbiting Carbon Observatory. We have new and forthcoming sensors that are increasingly allowing us to get at direct measurements of fluxes and carbon and methane emissions, which is really critical. But again, all of these data really need to be improved in terms of our ability to use these data in the tropics. Really requires a campaign like PANGEA to advance and kind of overcome some major process knowledge gaps as well as major data gaps in the tropics. And so PANGEA is really focused on this coordinated data collection approach to ultimately improve our ability to use these kinds of satellite data sets in the tropics by taking this scaling approach, this multi-scale approach. And we're focusing on landscapes that encompass not just intact systems, but also degraded and disturbed systems, wetlands and peatlands, as well as agricultural systems, to really capture the heterogeneity nested within a landscape, and then having multiple landscapes in different locations to improve, again, our ability to ultimately utilize these satellite remote sensing data sets and improve our ability to understand how this heterogeneity corresponds to these processes that need to be better understood. And so PANGEA would entail coordinated ground, tower, airborne, and spaceborne observations across a set of landscapes. The measurements that we're focusing on are detailed in the white paper. This is a table with a lot of information, and I just put a screenshot of it here really to emphasize that this table, which spans 3 pages in the white paper, is really there for you all to take a look at, and we would very much be interested in input on what's missing here, what maybe needs to be rethought in this table. So you can find this on pages 60 through 62 of the white paper, and it details all these different variables of interest on the left to PANGEA, how that links to our science questions, and then the different measurements at different scales that we currently are considering to be important to PANGEA, but again, would really value your input on. So the domain, the geographic domain of PANGEA is really focused on a core domain and an extended domain. The extended domain is pantropical, and all satellite remote sensing analyses and modeling analyses could really be carried out across this extended domain. And including this extended domain also allows for the opportunistic inclusion of additional opportunistic data sets. For example, airborne campaigns that are already happening either by NASA or through partner agencies, and the opportunity to include additional ground data that's being collected by partners across the tropics. The core domain is really where PANGEA is proposing these candidate landscapes be focused. And there's a bit of kind of a NASA approach to thinking about this in terms of a modular campaign approach that allows for different scales of PANGEA based on different funding amounts. So the optimal campaign is really what we see as being the ideal campaign. If there's no limits to funding and capabilities, the primary focus should really be on capturing at least 2 landscapes in Africa and at least 2 landscapes in the Americas to allow for a real comparison and capturing heterogeneity across these 2 continents, but also within these 2 continents, and a focusing on measurements at the onset and end of the dry season to capture differences seasonally in terms of function. The baseline is a bit of a reduction down from that to just focusing on 2 landscapes in the Americas and Africa. And then the threshold is really, if funding's truly limited, at the minimum, what we need to achieve PANGEA's objectives would be capturing these measurements, these coordinated measurements at 2 landscapes in Africa, and then relying on existing data, planned missions, commercial data buys, deployable drones, kind of a suite of pulling in opportunistic data over the Americas for that comparison approach. And the reason we're really prioritizing Africa is because there's massive knowledge and data gaps there compared to other parts of the tropics. And increasingly, it's really being prioritized as and kind of highlighted as a potentially globally important ecosystem. And PANGEA, in proposing this approach, is really building on previous successes. And there are many airborne campaigns that have successfully been carried out across different parts of the tropics and internationally, led by NASA. A recent one that we want to highlight is AFRISAR-2, which was a recent campaign that flew L-band and P-band UAV SAR data over many countries in Africa. So those include Cameroon, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Gabon, Ghana, the Republic of Congo, and Sao Tome and Principe. And these flight lines here are the actual flown flight lines across, again, many countries in Central and West Africa. And there were also plans to fly countries that were not flown in the end, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Tanzania. And PANGEA is also really working hard to understand how it can build on lessons learned from AFRISAR. So for example, Rwanda had a political election at the time of the planned flights and didn't want foreign aircraft in their airspace during an election period. And so thinking about the timing of these flights is something PANGEA is thinking about. Nigeria required a lot of permissions because rather than a single national authority, there are decentralized regional authorities within Nigeria that have to approve a flight like this. And so that would have taken a lot more time to get those permissions. So again, PANGEA is really thinking about how to build on these successes of the many campaigns that NASA has carried out, and how to also learn from the lessons of these campaigns to try to ensure a successful campaign. And again, just briefly coming back to why PANGEA is so focused on that threshold of being focused on Central African tropical forests. There's been a lot of recent attention that is really, I think, importantly highlighting the need to fill in knowledge and data gaps in these African tropical forests. I'm just highlighting two papers that recently came out, a call from several ministers from different ministries and governments across Central Africa, really emphasizing the need for an investment in science in this region to improve our ability to understand it and how it's responding to changes similar to levels of investment that have occurred in other parts of the tropics. And then a real opportunity to support local scientific capacity to carry out this research, given the dearth that currently exists. And so that's something that PANGEA is really emphasizing. There's a huge training element within PANGEA, and that's focused on, importantly, supporting and training and educating the next generation of scientists and workforce in the US, but also in partnership with scientists from the tropical countries in which PANGEA would be carried out. And I'm happy to answer more questions, and we have a section on that in the white paper. In terms of the timeline for PANGEA, it would, as I mentioned, we would hear about selection next year, early in 2025. And at that point, there would be a concise experimental plan that would be drafted, really taking this information that's put into the white paper from this scoping process and turning that into a more detailed plan based on what funding is actually available and what landscapes are ultimately selected. There would be, we're proposing a three-phase campaign. So phase one would include competed science call and proposals that would be selected. And there would be a science and applications team that would emerge from that process. And that would allow for about 3 years of phase one period of PANGEA with airborne campaigns throughout. And then a phase two, which would have a third and fourth airborne campaign and a second science and applications team. And then a final period that would allow for a backup airborne campaign opportunity and additional, potentially a slightly shorter time frame for final science and applications activities. There's also a really important element of this, which I alluded to when I said science and applications, which is the opportunity to not just conduct science, but improve our ability to use that science for decision making. So PANGEA is really highly relevant to a new strategy that NASA headquarters has rolled out this year, which is called the NASA Earth Science to Action strategy, that's really focused on improving integration between the research, the science, NASA's RNA programs with NASA's formerly applications, now Earth Action programs, which really take that science and translate it into action. And there's a few areas in which we think PANGEA is really well suited to contribute to these kinds of activities, namely focusing on carbon sequestration and methane fluxes, as well as biodiversity conservation and sustainable agriculture. So we have a whole section in the white paper that outlines how we view PANGEA as an opportunity to carry out this kind of integrated work, thinking about not just the science, but also the decision-making and actions that can result from those science activities. And the importance of thinking about that from the outset of the campaign, because critically, that sort of work requires close collaboration with partners who can take that scientific knowledge, those new advanced monitoring capabilities, and turn that into action. And so we have potential partners listed here, and we've been talking to many, many, many partners throughout the process of scoping PANGEA. who are very interested in a campaign like this for this reason. So really the what is in this white paper is not meant to reflect the leadership team or even just the working group leads. We've carried out an enormous amount of different activities, workshops, meetings, symposium to include as many voices as possible and represent as many different priorities as possible into what is distilled in this white paper. So over the past year, we've had 5 different workshops across the tropics primarily, in Central Africa and South America and Southeast Asia, as well as a big workshop in DC. We've presented on PANGEA at over 18 different conferences that often included different workshop opportunities to workshop ideas and get input. And we've had 100 plus, and we're continuing to have many, many partner meetings to continue to develop these ideas and make sure that what we're proposing is relevant not just to the scientific community, but also to, for example, indigenous and local communities who live and work in these regions, and practitioners who would take the data that would result from a campaign like PANGEA. So an example of the many partners listed here. There's many others who are going to be outlined in the final white paper that's submitted to NASA headquarters on December 6th. And what I want to underscore is that PANGEA is really not only building on the successes of many NASA campaigns and terrestrial ecology field campaigns, but also a lot of work that's already ongoing in the tropics. And PANGEA is not attempting to duplicate any of these efforts. What we're trying to do is really make sure that there's an opportunity to fill in the key gaps that are not currently being filled by a lot of these efforts, critically by partnering with these many efforts that are already ongoing. So again, something we're doing is trying to ensure that what is put down in this white paper complements and reinforces and fills in gaps based on all these existing activities. And so an example, we have a community engagement section that we would really value input on as well. And this is an example of engagement with scientific partners. What PANGEA sees that as including is really the co-development of research and analysis and potential applications with PANGEA partners. The partnership in identifying field sites and research infrastructure and capabilities critical to really carrying out PANGEA's objectives. A focus on co-production and sharing and management of data, supporting the development of data infrastructure and equipment and management and expertise at local and regional institutions, and strengthening and broadening research infrastructure and instrumentation for local and regional partnering institutions, and designing and implementing strategies to support faculty and early career researchers, again, in these countries, so that the legacy of PANGEA really lives through an amazing data set that emerges from PANGEA, but also these relationships and the capacity kind of injected into institutions and individuals throughout the course of the PANGEA campaign. So in wrapping up, I want to emphasize 3 key pillars to PANGEA, which is the science, again, improving our ability to understand these different heterogeneous responses to land use and climate change dynamics in the tropics. But the second pillar really is this capacity building, training the next generation of scientists and leaders from the region to be able to lead these efforts in partnership with researchers in the US and in Europe and internationally. And then the third pillar is thinking about these pathways to action. There's a real opportunity that I mentioned before to improve our ability to use these many different satellite remote sensing data sets that we now have access to in the tropics. And thinking about monitoring capabilities from the outset will really allow for a lot of different individuals, organizations, institutions, governments to improve their ability to monitor carbon, biodiversity, and agriculture using satellite remote sensing. So that's really a core part of what we're thinking about at the outset as well. We really, really want to hear your feedback. As I mentioned, we've really been working hard to make sure we include as many voices into the white paper as possible. But we also know that there's a lot of people we haven't been able to connect with or connect with enough. And so as you go through the white paper, I've highlighted just a few places that we would really value your feedback. Of course, you're welcome to comment on any element of the white paper, but in particular, we would be really interested in hearing what science questions you all feel are the most important, the most tractable, could really move the needle with a campaign like this. What candidate landscapes are important to include. So we have a table and then more information that's detailed on pages 71 through 73 in the white paper. We're not going to select landscapes during this part of the process. That would come once PANGEA is selected during the development of that concise experimental plan. But what we do want to do is highlight all the potential landscapes where PANGEA could focus based on where existing data and efforts and priorities are. And then we also, as I mentioned, have this strategy for engagement, and that includes engagement with scientific institutions, government partners, the private sector, Indigenous and local communities. And we would really value input on that strategy for engagement. So as a reminder, the timeline is down here. The white paper was released on the 20th, and we have an opportunity to receive your comments through the NASA survey until November 5th. And then our team will be taking those comments and responding to them and incorporating updates into the final white paper, which we will submit to NASA headquarters on December 6th. The other, and I think final thing I want to mention is that NASA is already very much working hard to incorporate input that's emerged from the PANGEA and ARID scoping processes. So there's actually a solicitation out right now for funding through the NASA Carbon Cycle Science Program. And I've just included some snippets here just to say that the notices of intent are due October 17th, so it's right around the corner, but these are very short notices of intent that are really aimed at you all proposing what you plan on doing and how this will contribute to the use of NASA satellite remote sensing data sets. And full proposals are not due until February 3rd, so there's still time. And there's, again, really two sections that call out the opportunities to advance our understanding of dryland systems and tropical systems. So sub-element 3.2.2 is specifically focused on the vulnerability of tropical forests. And so you can almost think of this in some ways as kind of like a precursor, an opportunity to kind of get going on some of the elements of PANGEA with existing data sets that are out there. So I highly encourage you all to take a look at this and submit a proposal. With that, I am happy to take questions. We have a lot of our team members here as well, who I know would be happy to chime in and help answer questions and get a discussion going. So I'll leave this up for a moment and then take it down, but I'll check the chat. Whoops, sorry, I will pull it back up. I'll check the chat, and now that blue thing's gone. Amazing. But if you do have a question, please also feel free to raise your hand and unmute yourself. So thanks very much for your attention. I see we've got one question in the chat already. Are the mountain ecosystems part of the study? It seemed like the map may have cut them off. These are important systems. Yeah, so the short answer is montane systems are not currently being explicitly considered. Although if you feel strongly that they should be, we want to hear from you. I mean, at the end of the day, PANGEA is already quite lofty and ambitious in what we're proposing, not only in the science, but also in the geographic scope. And we have had to really draw lines and define boundaries in some places to make sure that we fit within what's within the scope of a 6 to 9 year campaign. And in terms of just capturing different landscapes in different places to be representative enough. So we have opted not to include montane systems for now, because that does seem to fall kind of outside the scope of what's feasible. But again, if you can make a compelling case, we would love to hear from you. I think there are obviously really important dynamics in montane systems and important gradients across elevation gradients that could be captured, and also thinking about hydrologic systems. So there's clearly a real need, but whether or not it's within the scope of PANGEA is something we would love to hear from you all about. Does anybody else on the leadership team or in our working groups want to comment in response to the montane systems question?
Hi, this is Michael. You know, it's really hard to exclude anything, but if we're going to have a practicable campaign, we need to do that. Montane systems contain cover a relatively small area, less than 10% of the Amazon basin, for example, is above about 1,000 meters. And so, we have to make hard choices. I think the hard choices have to reflect our concerns with global biogeochemistry, carbon cycle, water cycle, and the other main themes of the project.
Thanks for that. And thanks for the question. Do we have any other questions? Yes, Josh. Many of us contributed to the various working groups. I assume you all tried to incorporate as much as possible, but also assume you had to make decisions to cut some things out. I'm wondering what parts you all decided to keep out, more on science measurements than geography. Yeah, it's a good question. There are certain things like, for example, below ground dynamics, which were a major sticking point. Well, not a major sticking point, but something we kind of went back and forth on because, of course, below ground dynamics, whether you're talking about below ground carbon in soils, but also microbial dynamics, for example, are all critically important, but seemed to be outside the scope of what we could do within a campaign that's really focused on remote sensing, where the remote sensing capabilities of those things are limited and changing a lot. It's not to say that a lot of people are not exploring that, but especially in tropical systems, there's, I think, lower hanging fruit and kind of easier to tackle priorities. Um, what else? Montane systems on the science side. Um, let's see. I think certain elements of I'm having a hard time thinking of like all the things I mean, we've clearly included a lot, right, in the science. And one of the things we really want input on is how to continue to kind of pare down some of the science questions into really core science questions. Um, below ground dynamics, certain elements of different kind of diversity, what's feasible within what we can accomplish with diversity mapping. There's a lot that I think is really interesting on the kind of pushing species mapping capabilities and things like that. But also that's just not within the scope of a campaign like this and a system like the tropics that's incredibly diverse. Um, let's see, are there,
There's another question in the chat.
yeah, I'm curious before moving to that one really quickly, any folks on in the working groups who can think of things that were really interesting topics that just kind of had to get shuffled to the side as a result of scope? Okay. I'll go to the next question in the chat and then I see Kevin's hand is up. But Josh, it's a really good question. And I think maybe one thing I could even do is have a little paragraph in the final white paper that just kind of lists a few of those things that didn't end up making it in, even though they came up quite a bit. Let's go to the next question in the chat, and then Kevin, I'll come to you. So given that American forests are so overrepresented in the existing literature, is there a reason Pangea is not choosing two African landscapes and two Southeast Asian landscapes, given that, yes, Southeast Asia has similar data shortages and training shortages, while being a huge land use change hotspot and the main peatland carbon sink in the tropics? Very, very good points. Yeah, we also spent a lot of time thinking about the candidate landscapes, and there's a few reasons that we ended up sticking with the core landscape as being focused on the Americas, Africa. From a kind of a scientific perspective, the opportunity for comparison between the two basins is an important one. And we can see, for example, the contrasts in like large scale land use change in the Amazon compared to more dispersed small scale change in Africa. There's an opportunity for comparison there that would, of course, be also important to include with Southeast Asia, but it's a bit more of a kind of a natural comparison in basins in terms of also land atmosphere interactions. It's a kind of a more tractable comparison in terms of flights, airborne campaigns from the Americas, or from, sorry, North America. It's easier to reach from the US if we were to use NASA aircraft. And then the opportunity to kind of fall back on a threshold campaign that would focus on just Africa, because the paradox is, because there's already quite a lot of data and ongoing efforts in the Americas, there's an opportunity to make that comparison still, even if we were really only able to focus on coordinated landscape data collection in Africa. And it's not at all to say that Southeast Asian tropical systems are not critically important. It was just truly really a geographic scope question, and then kind of what makes for a more tractable comparison. So it was a challenging thing to think about. The reason we really pushed hard to, and ultimately decided to include this extended domain, is so that we can, again, opportunistically include work going on in Southeast Asia. There is a lot of work going on there, and there are potential campaigns, airborne campaigns that could be rolled into PANGEA. So one quick example is potential ELVIS, airborne LiDAR flights that NASA will be carrying out in 2025 in parts of Southeast Asia. And so the opportunity is there to fold in those kinds of activities. Let's go to Kevin, and then I'll come back to the chat in just a minute.
Hi, Elsa. Thanks. I just wanted to bring back up the question of whenever Pangea makes its way through, the sort of the stability of the tropical forests, especially in the Amazon, is going to be a continued question, especially relative to so-called tipping points, fragmentation, and sort of a change in the arc. But I didn't see that explicitly noted, and I think we talked about this at the Taking Stock of Stocks, but I just wanted to have you comment a bit on how you see the role of that sort of potential for very rapid changes figuring into the way the experimental design and analysis would be taken out for Pangea.
It's a great question. So tipping points came up quite a bit throughout, and we have, I think that's another reason, honestly, that thinking about this comparison between Africa and the Americas is important. There's potentially really big differences in what systems are, in systems having different thresholds. And so some of our science questions, if you go to our sub questions, there are some on key thresholds. We tended to use the language thresholds instead of tipping points in the white paper. There's, I think, a lot of use of the term tipping point that can kind of detract in some cases from really getting at the more detailed understanding of what elements of these systems are changing and over what timescales and in what ways. And so we wanted to focus on that. But I would say elements of understanding how these systems are changing and what their thresholds are is very much a part of Pangea, and it is really kind of embedded in some of those sub-questions, and is a big reason we're focusing on this comparison between the Americas and Africa. But I'm curious if Michael or others on our team would like to also respond to that.
Kevin, with regard to, we wanted to stay away from the word tipping points because there's too much focus on the so-called point. And, while Rome is burning, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to worry about whether the point is 20% of the Amazon or 40% of the Amazon or 30%. It's bad. And so we thought about tipping elements, and I think we got to thresholds because we thought of that as more productive. Aside from that, I don't think I want to add, I don't think I want to add anything. I think Elsa covered it.
Thanks, Michael. I'm going to try to knock out a few questions in the chat. Please do raise your hand if you have a question and don't want to put it in the chat. Moses asks, what will the choice be, PANGEA or ARID, or could NASA consider elements of both? Yeah, there's real opportunities for NASA to select one or both. There's also a possibility that NASA would select neither if there's drastic funding issues. I think the more likely occurrence will be one or elements of both. I know that NASA is very interested in aspects that are being presented in both PANGEA and ARID, and they recognize that both are tackling really important topics. And I know a lot of folks in the research community would like to see both or elements of both funded. And truly, I think it comes down to funding limitations. So that's about all I can say at this point, other than to say, at one point, we were talking to ARID about kind of discussing inclusion of a section in the white paper that would speak to opportunities for coordination between the two. And because of just how much time it's taken to scope each of these individually, we've moved forward with really doing our due diligence and scoping what we initially proposed. But we do see some real opportunities for thinking about, for example, kind of a wet-dry transect in one of these two continents, the Americas or Africa, for example, as a possibility to incorporate both. So it has come up. Angelica says, I'm aware there have been conversations of funding opportunities outside the US. If PANGEA passes, I wonder where those conversations are now in terms of funding and possibilities to non-US institutions. The short answer is they're still very much in progress, but we are actively exploring opportunities to match and complement and support NASA funding, specifically so that we can ensure that there's opportunities to support folks at non-US institutions. I will say that that's already, you know, the Ryan Pavlik, who's the one of the two terrestrial ecology program managers, has already started to incorporate thinking about that into this recent carbon cycle science solicitation. So there's information on that there and kind of NASA's approach to that there. But we are talking to the donor community, other agencies that would be kind of analogous to funding agencies in the US in other places, for example, in Europe. We've been exploring opportunities for government funding from countries in the tropics, which varies greatly from one country to the next. And we've also been exploring donor funding to support elements of this where there may not be direct funding, for example, from government agencies in tropical countries. So we're trying really hard to gather as much information, have as much input as possible to kind of lay out that landscape of possible funding opportunities and potentially, hopefully, even get some funding commitments. So we're working really hard on that. As all African forest is covered, why not including Madagascar? It's a great question. Madagascar is from a kind of a diversity and evolutionarily and hydrologically just very different. And so there's also systems kind of throughout the continent of Africa that we could be including, but have kind of limited it to this tropical humid forest within this contiguous area of Central West Africa, again, really for the science question regions. But I would say Madagascar is very much included in that extended domain. Bruno, what are the key theoretical areas that PANGEA aims to address? It seems there's a focus on carbon cycles, but other areas, biodiversity, social ecological systems are also mentioned. It would be great to know if the project aims to address science questions in all of these or fields or focus on some of them. I don't know where these lines are emerging from. It's weird.
People are drawing them because there's a facility to use
the whiteboard or something.
Whiteboard or pens or something like that. Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe folks would refrain from graffiti. I think it's unintentional.
Got it. I'm sure it is. Okay. Coming back to Bruno's question, it's a really good one. There's only so much I could kind of fit within this presentation. And to kind of the core of PANGEA is focused on these carbon cycle dynamics and these climate feedbacks, but there are very much questions related to biodiversity dynamics and social ecological systems dynamics. And that's within the white paper. If I'll just point you to the questions and then the science thematic areas. So there's specific sections that give the overview of the scientific motivation for each of those different themes, including biodiversity and social ecological systems. And then our sub questions are really integrating across these different disciplines to ask questions more related to pattern, process, and projections. But there are questions that really do touch on themes of these. So I would encourage you to go to those sections in the white paper, and then please provide input if you see opportunities for updating those science questions. And I think, unfortunately, since we're at time, I will save this chat, and I believe Michael was able to get to the final question. I see people already hopping off, but I just want to thank you all again for making the time to join us. We're really interested in hearing your input, so please do fill out the survey, and I will make sure that this recording is up on our website for those of you who would like to share this with colleagues or just re-review it yourselves. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day.